Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sam. I'm one of the librarians here, and I'll be running our Great Decisions program tonight. Before we begin, we just want to thank our major sponsors. Without them, this program wouldn't be able to happen. And they are the Franklin Public Library Foundation, the Jerome J. and Dorothy H. Holtz Family Foundation, as well as Carol and Tom Donovan. So thank you to all of those generous supporters.
Ran out of regular, so it's half and half.
Tonight we have Dr. Beth Dougherty. She is the Managing Professor of International Relations and Professor of Political Science at Beloit College. She received her MA and PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. She has chaired the Beloit College's International Relations program since 1996 and has been a frequent speaker at past Franklin Public Library Great Decisions discussion series. So please welcome Dr. Beth Dougherty.
I just need to switch over to my own slides. Yes, very good. Okay, so the Great Decisions book, the article was talking about the past for the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and then what the future is going to be. It was written at a point they would have known the Trump administration had been elected, but obviously would have had no idea what kind of policies were going to be put into place. So what I want to look at tonight is at the United States' role and its interests in the Middle East through the lens of two recent Trump administration actions. The first being the situation in Gaza, and then the second one being the freeze on foreign aid. Just as a reminder, these are the key American interests, and interests are usually defined as something that would transcend just one administration. These would be interests of the United States regardless of who is in power. And so in virtually every administration since the Second World War, you can see elements of these in their strategy in the Middle East. Counterterrorism, in particular, continuing to make sure that the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and other radical actors are not able to reconstitute themselves in the region. A dedication to Israel's safety and security, which includes a commitment to ensure what Israel has what's called a qualitative military edge. In other words, that it will always be more militarily prepared than any of its neighbors. The U.S. has also, since 1967, been promoting the notion of the two-state solution, right, to the broader Israel-Palestinian conflict. Third main interest is to maintain positive relations with the moderate Arab states that are American allies, and notably there it would be Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. Fourthly, to prevent the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon. Ever since the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979, containing Iran's influence and actions in the region has been a major focus of American foreign policy. And that has included its support for terrorist groups and other destabilizing or malign actors, as the United States would call them, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, Iran's ballistic missile program, and then its general human rights record, particularly its abuses against women, have all been a focus of American policy. And then lastly, the United States is committed to ensure the freedom of navigation and the free flow of oil from the region. Even though the United States itself doesn't really need that much oil from the Persian Gulf countries, our allies, especially in Eastern Europe and Asia, do. And so the United States is committed to ensuring that these small flashpoint areas, the Strait of Hormuz, which allows you to get out of the Persian Gulf into the Indian Ocean, the Bab el-Mandab Strait, which is between the Horn of Africa and Yemen, and then the Suez Canal, right at the top of the Red Sea. Okay. So I'm going to first lay out the two issues I want to talk about, foreign aid and U.S. policy towards Gaza. And then I'm going to draw out a series of lessons that I think we can learn for U.S. foreign policy from the way the administration has treated these two particular issue areas. So the first one is about foreign aid. Right? Trump issued an executive order on January 20th calling for a 90-day suspension of foreign aid. There was a waiver for the aid that goes to Israel. The U.S. sends $3 billion a year to Israel, and to Egypt, $1.3 billion. In both of those cases, it's nearly entirely military aid. That was given a waiver. Theoretically, they said there was a waiver that would be placed there for life-saving programs. The suspension on foreign aid was coupled with an assault on the main foreign aid distributing agency of the United States government, USAID, the Agency for International Development. Most of the staff of USAID were put on administrative leave. They were told not to go back to the office. Email systems were shut down. The AID payment website was shut down. And the website completely disappeared off the internet. So you couldn't even go and find out what USAID used to do because the website is no longer working. Every president since World War II has been a strong supporter of foreign aid. And in particular, after the Kennedy administration put together USAID, they have been strong supporters for this agency. In March of 2024, an amendment was put before the House of Representatives that would have eliminated all foreign assistance from the budget for fiscal year 2025. It was defeated by 80% of the House voted against that. Okay. Just a few quick facts about foreign aid. One, people have crazy ideas about how much money the United States spends on foreign aid. Public opinion polling across the years has pretty consistently shown that most Americans think the U.S. spends about 25% of the federal budget on foreign aid. And when they're asked, they think actually 10% is a reasonable amount for the U.S. to spend. As a percentage of the U.S.'s gross domestic product, foreign aid is actually 0.33%, less than 1%, right? Putting it at the bottom of advanced industrial democracies. Everybody in Europe gives more money as a percentage of gross domestic product than does the United States. In absolute terms, the U.S. gives more money, but only because its economy is so much larger than everybody else's, right? In terms of its relationship to total federal expenditures in the last, I think this is for fiscal year 2023, as a percentage of total federal expenditures, foreign aid amounted to 1.17%. The Department of Defense, on the other hand, spent over 13%, or $820.3 billion. The entire budget for foreign aid is $68 billion. Of that, $43.4 billion is being administered by USAID. So most U.S. foreign aid assistance is going to go through USAID. Note that the United States represents 40% of all spending on global humanitarian spending, and that the Middle East is very well represented in terms of the overall direction of U.S. foreign aid and also from aid from the USAID. So Jordan, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Syria were all in the top 10 for fiscal year 2023. I think you could make the argument that Somalia, for example, is sort of Middle East adjacent, and so you might also want to throw it into that category. What do we use foreign aid for? The largest amount of that goes towards economic development, right? Followed by humanitarian assistance, spending on health, in particular HIV/AIDS spending. Peace and security is another major category, education and social services, etc. But the basic idea behind U.S. foreign aid is the U.S. is going to help other countries fund economic development, provide humanitarian assistance in war zones and during disasters, work to prevent disease, and to promote democracy. Okay? All right, so that's the foreign aid piece. Second piece is Israel, right, and Gaza. So the United States gives more money to Israel than it does to any other country. There's all kinds of special privileges that Israel gets in terms of U.S. assistance. But I would note that anymore we're signing 10-year memorandums of understanding with Israel, right? And so the U.S. is giving at least $3 billion a year plus an additional $500 million that goes towards missile defense. There's enormous continuity from Republican to Democratic to Republican administrations around Israel. In many ways, it's one of the only truly bipartisan things that are out there anymore. Most Americans agree that the United States should be committed to the safety and security of Israel. Under the Trump administration's first term, his major accomplishment was the signing of the Abraham Accords, which were normalization agreements between a number of Arab states, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco, that they signed with Israel. So they established diplomatic relations, would engage in trade with one another, etc. There are a number of other things, though, in the first Trump administration. December of 2017, the United States formally recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Secondly, it accepted Israel's annexation of occupied Syrian territory, the Golan Heights, in March of 2019. In November of 2019, the Trump administration overturned decades of State Department policy and said that Israeli settlements being built in the occupied territories do not violate international law. And lastly, the U.S. ambassador to Israel in June of 2019 said that he believed that Israel had the right to retain some of the occupied West Bank. So there's a lot of continuity actually between Trump, one, and then the Biden administration when it arrived. The Biden administration also tried to advance the Abraham Accords. I mean, the kind of the white whale out there is getting Saudi Arabia to sign on to the Abraham Accords. The Biden administration never revoked the policy on the Golan Heights. It did reverse the policy on settlements. It went back to the traditional American stance that settlements violate international law. And of course, it provided massive support for the Israelis in the aftermath of the October 7 attacks. And that includes cutting off funding for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which is the agency that the U.S. set up, or the UN set up after the 1948-49 Arab-Israeli War to deal with the Palestinian refugee problem. And so it has been in existence since then. As the second Trump administration has come in, it continued to supply weapons to the Israelis, maintained the ban on the funding for UNRWA. Benjamin Netanyahu was the first foreign leader that the Trump administration wanted to host at the White House. And that brings us to the February 4th press conference that was held by Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. At the press conference, the president said all of the following things. Gaza is unlivable, right? He repeatedly referred to it as a demolition site or as hell. He said that the United States will either own or take Gaza. He said Palestinians will be moved elsewhere. He talked about leveling Gaza and turning it into the Riviera of the Middle East. He mentioned that no U.S. troops, no boots on the ground, no U.S. troops would be involved, and no U.S. funds would be involved either, because we would make the rich Arab states pay for this plan. Before I start talking about Gaza, just to remind everybody, it's this tiny strip of territory. It is incredibly densely populated, right? You have 650,000 people in Gaza City, for example, who live in 18 square miles. And I have the square footage and the population of Franklin, just to give you some sort of indication of what we're talking about here, right? Trump is indeed correct. Gaza is a demolition site. This is a very dire humanitarian situation. Although I will say during the press conference, there was no acknowledgement of how Gaza got to look this way. and no sign that the United States felt any responsibility for supplying the 1,000 and 2,000 pound bombs that the Israelis used during their bombardment of the Gaza Strip. I would note, according to the United Nations, and they use satellites to be able to do this kind of thing, 92% of the homes and apartments in the Gaza Strip are damaged or destroyed. 88% of the schools damaged or destroyed. 68% of the road network is damaged or destroyed. The United Nations has estimated that there are 50 million tons of rubble, and that it would take 21 years and up to $1.2 billion to clear the rubble from Gaza. Of course, there are fears that there could be at least 10,000 bodies that are buried underneath of the rubble. And I recently read that there are now serious concerns about the amount of asbestos was used in these building materials that's going to be contaminating the site. Plus you have leftover munitions, explosives, etc. And all of that will need to be cleared out of the rubble. At the time the ceasefire went into effect between Hamas and Israel, 90% of Gaza's population of 2.1 million people had been displaced. Just for comparison, the population of Houston is 2.3 million people, so they're roughly analogous, Gaza and Houston. 80% of that population was under an evacuation order in November of last year. And there are currently 1.875 million people who need emergency shelter in Gaza. 72% of Gaza's cropland, 80% of its orchards and trees, 57% of its greenhouses, 68% of its agricultural wells been damaged or destroyed. 95% of all the cattle in Gaza are dead, and the number is even higher for birds. 72% of Gaza's fishing fleet has been destroyed. People have been displaced, so obviously they have been unable to plant for next year's crops. They are not going to be able to feed themselves in the foreseeable future. The land has been badly damaged by the war, so the dependence on food aid by people in Gaza is going to continue for the foreseeable future, and it will be extensive. There's already widespread malnutrition and acute food insecurity in Gaza, with 345,000 people facing what the UN calls catastrophic food insecurity. So that's just for some background on Gaza. All right, so I think there are major concerns that we should have about the policy, personnel, and process that the Trump administration has brought back in just in these first few weeks that it has been in office. I want to start with personnel. Elise Stefanik, who when the Republicans eventually get the budget through, they will confirm her as the ambassador to the United Nations. But at her confirmation hearings, Elise Stefanik said that she believed that Israel had a biblical right to the West Bank. And she uses the words Judea and Samaria to refer to that area, as do the hardline Israeli right. Mike Huckabee, who has been named as the ambassador to Israel, is a long-time supporter of the notion that Israel has a biblical claim to the land of the West Bank, right? And the first quote from January 2017, he says, there's no such thing as a settlement, they're communities, they're neighborhoods, they're cities. There's no such thing as an occupation, right? He said, it makes it appear as if someone is illegally taking land, and I don't see it that way, right? I never supported ever the notion that a two-state solution would mean that Israelis would be disrupted from their homeland, right? I think the notion of two governments operating on the same piece of real estate is unrealistic and unworkable. So the pictures are actually of different times when Mike Huckabee actually laid foundation stones for Israeli settlements in occupied West Bank territory. Virtually everyone believes that the settlements in the West Bank are the biggest obstacle to some sort of lasting peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And so it's concerning that you have people like Huckabee and Stefanik because they are aligned actually with the far right settler bloc in Israel, the most extreme portions of the Israeli government. That's who espouses these types of positions. And then if we're going to talk about aid, foreign aid, the role that Elon Musk is playing in this is highly, highly, highly problematic. He has been using X to amplify unverified claims and conspiracy theories that are being posted to the web from a small handful of fringe accounts. Many of these accounts are, in fact, anonymous. They have been pushing two arguments: that USAID is a tool of the left, and secondly, that USAID is a lawless, deep state organization with no oversight and rife with fraud. In particular, Musk has been relying on posts by a former Trump administration official, Mike Benz, who has been claiming since 2022 that USAID is a covert psychological operation being run by the Central Intelligence Agency, which is attempting to ensure censorship at home and abroad, rig elections, and spread anti-Trump sentiment. Musk has millions of followers on his X account, and he has been blasting out information, well, disinformation about USAID. This one, again, coming from an anonymous account, he says, "Did you know that USAID, using your tax dollars, funded bioweapon research, including COVID-19, that killed millions of people?" This is absolutely false. This has been repeatedly debunked. The second one says, "Did you know that USAID spent your tax dollars to fund celebrity trips to Ukraine, all to boost Zelensky's popularity among Americans?" This particular rumor originates from a Russian troll farm. It is clearly Russian disinformation, right? But Elon Musk is sending these kinds of messages out, actually not on a daily basis, multiple times a day, feeding all kinds of falsehoods about USAID and foreign aid. And that is exceedingly problematic. That's a personnel problem, right? Then there is a process problem with all of this. The January 20 order that called for the 90-day pause on new foreign aid obligations was very badly planned. I mean, I would call this aid freeze amateurish, right? The directives were unclear and vague. They were freezing disbursements for funds that had already been appropriated by Congress to reimburse people for work that they had already done, right? But money that had not yet been sent to those programs. There was a waiver for the foreign military financing for Israel and Egypt, but no details about what kind of a process aid agencies would use if you were filing for a life-saving aid waiver. On January 24th, the administration sent a notice to all diplomatic and consular officials that required all grant and contract officers to immediately issue stop work orders for all existing foreign assistance awards. This means that work that was already underway was immediately halted. Things just simply closed down, okay, because they were unclear about whether or not there was going to be any aid for this. USAID received less than $1 million or $100 million in exemptions for life-saving things out of $40 billion worth of assistance that it has. PEPFAR, which is the program that President George W. Bush put together to combat HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, received a waiver on February 1st, but only for certain activities, and no other waivers have been announced for any other global U.S. health program. The vast majority of the staff at USAID has been either fired or placed on administrative leave. Practically, what this has meant is that virtually all humanitarian assistance programs funded by the United States, even in part, have ground to a complete halt. There is no staff to manage these programs. There is no one to answer the phones or to answer questions. If USAID staff who are abroad, for example, need information, there's no one to answer the phones at the agency. The website was eliminated. People lost their email access. As I said, the payment system has been closed down. And many humanitarian organizations which think they are engaging in life-saving work and would be eligible for a waiver are afraid to go ahead and continue with their work, because if they're wrong, the consequences for that will be very severe. When the 90-day review is up, there may not actually be the capacity to restart humanitarian assistance programs. People have lost their jobs. Organizations both in the United States and abroad have had to furlough their staff. Some of these organizations have had to close. There's food aid that is going to be, will have expired by the time this 90-day passing has come. There was no plan in place for what you would do about U.S. humanitarian assistance. And Marco Rubio's response was, well, we said life-saving assistance, but they never told anyone how they could apply for waivers. And anyway, there isn't anyone working at USAID who could process those waivers. And then in terms of process, there is Trump's idea about turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. These are all cartoons that were published right after he made this suggestion. Half the time, I'm not even sure what I should call this. We'll say it was a suggestion. It certainly was not a proposal or a plan, because that implies details and specificity and thinking. This really, literally, was a half-formed idea in Trump's head that he said in front of the International Press Corps at an official press conference with the visiting head of Israel. There was no planning, no consultation, no prep work before they said, this is like a major bombshell kind of announcement. And they did no preliminary work. Trump himself couldn't even answer basic questions about exactly what this proposal meant, right? He had been discussing moving Palestinians from Gaza for several weeks, but the idea that the US would take Gaza or own Gaza or run Gaza was a new twist his own people did not even know he was planning to do. He apparently told Netanyahu that he was going to make this announcement right before they walked out on the stage for this press conference. Trump was vague about what US commitments would be here, vague about who was going to pay for this, vague about how the whole thing was going to work. He had to be pressed in the question and answer before they could get an answer about whether or not the Palestinians would be able to return. Ordinarily, if the United States is going to put forward a major foreign policy proposal, you would send it through the chain of command. It would go through agencies. They would, war game it out. They would do studies, right? They would have consulted with American allies. None of these things happened. Both of these events pose very serious and damaging questions about US credibility, right, as a partner, and about the feasibility of the United States maintaining its position as a global leader, which it is basically the post-World War II international system was set up to facilitate American leadership. But these decisions actually are striking at the very foundation of that leadership and credibility. With respect to USAID, in 2 weeks, the United States has destroyed the 60 years worth of trust, goodwill, partnerships, and expertise that it had built up in becoming the linchpin, the cornerstone of the entire international humanitarian assistance architecture. The United States government owes contractors, organizations, etc., for work they have already done for the United States government, for contracts that were put in place before the Trump administration was inaugurated. The Professional Services Council in the United States, which is the a professional organization of other organizations, mainly consulting firms, but they noted that Their membership alone was owed $500 million from the US government because of these aid freezes, right? On February 10th, USAID Inspector General report said that there was $489 million of food aid that was languishing in ports, warehouses, and in transit. He was promptly fired by the Trump administration for issuing this report. Groups that USAID funded abroad are now finding themselves under attack by their governments because of the lies that are being spread by Elon Musk and then amplified by Donald Trump. So the United States has been funding groups in Hungary, for example, civil society organizations and press freedom organizations, human rights groups. Well, now Viktor Orban is calling these people agents, right? And they are going to begin going after them. In India, there are agencies that the United States was funding that are actually civil society organizations that are mainly interested in Bangladesh but can't operate there because of the political climate, so they're are in India. But that contract was misrepresented by Musk and Trump as the United States funding election interference against Prime Minister Modi. And now those organizations are afraid. Press freedom organizations in a number of countries around the world where press freedom is at risk also fear that now that USAID is being called a criminal organization, right, that it's nothing but waste, fraud, and abuse, that their safety is now at risk. These individuals applied for grants to the United States because they believed that the United States stood for things like human rights and freedom. And now their lives are going to be put at risk because of this very poorly planned dismantling of USAID. I would also note, in terms of worrying about credibility, there was no planning for how this was going to affect USAID adjacent agencies. So $2 billion every year in food aid from US farmers goes abroad. Well, that's been halted. There are things like this for every single state in the union, detailing the number of organizations and the funding that those states get that is related to USAID. Farmers are very upset because it's not clear, right? If that $2 billion worth of food aid is just on the market, that drives prices down. That is bad for farmers. Okay? There are a number of individuals in the United States who do not work for USAID who have nonetheless lost their jobs because USAID funding supported the organization they did work for. And most NGOs simply don't have enough funding to be able to sustain themselves if a significant portion of their budget is just pulled out from underneath of their feet, which is exactly what has happened. Because it's a 90-day freeze, but there's no guarantee that the money will come back right after that 90 days. And when those 90 days are up, as I said before, for many of these organizations, they may not be able to get themselves back up and running because of the consequences that come from basically having no funding for 3 months. Credibility problems, leadership problems with respect to Gaza first. Did he really mean it? I mean, it's in many ways unbelievable. This is a conversation we're having about what the United States president said in an official event. Did he mean what he said, or was he just kind of talking? Right? To me, I find that highly problematic, right? You should be able to believe the US president when he is announcing a new US proposal. Because this was so ill-formed, his aides actually spent the next few days after that press conference either trying to interpret or walk back the comments, right? Only to have Trump double and triple down on this, right? He would then contradict his own people and say, no, that's not what I actually said. Right? But even more problematic was the lack of consultation with major US allies. Jordan, which is a major recipient, by the way, of USAID funding, and so it has been hit hard by the foreign aid freeze. A week after the press conference where Trump made this Gaza pitch, King Abdullah had to come to the White House for what was a painfully awkward meeting with Trump. You can see by the look on the king's face how distressed and unhappy he is. This proposal is profoundly destabilizing for Jordan. 2/3 of the Jordanian population are actually Palestinian. It has always been, the Jordanians have always felt uncertain about the identity of their population. Are they more Jordanian than Palestinian, or more Palestinian than Jordanian? And so Jordan is very sensitive to any kinds of discussions about Palestinians coming into, additional Palestinians coming into Jordan. The king is already under a lot of pressure in Jordan to reduce Jordan's dependency on the United States because of the US support for Israel post-October 7th, right? The Jordanians are concerned that this proposal is going to strengthen the hand of the Islamists in Jordan and therefore weaken the king. Jordan cannot possibly absorb Palestinians coming from Gaza. It already has one of the largest refugee populations per capita in the world because it's supporting a significant number of Syrian refugees who fled the war when that started in 2011. Jordanian officials were distraught. They were uncertain how they were supposed to approach this with the United States, given how dependent Jordan is on that. But it literally is an existential issue for Jordan. The king cannot possibly accept this suggestion and expect his own population to continue to support him. Not only did the United States not talk to Jordan, one of the countries where the US was planning to send the Palestinians, it also didn't talk to its ally, Egypt, right? Although it did say that Egypt could continue to get its $1.3 billion in military assistance when it froze all the rest of the foreign aid. Egypt also fears destabilization, not just of Egypt, but of the region in general. The Egyptians are very worried that this kind of rhetoric is going to strengthen the hands of extremists and radical Islamist groups, including some that are operating in the Sinai, which in the past have been very threatening to Egypt's domestic security. The Egyptians were upset because they believed the Trump administration had tacitly approved of comments that Netanyahu made later that publicly criticized Egypt as well as Saudi Arabia. And the Egyptians were angry about the way they were portrayed during Trump's press conference with Netanyahu because, as he typically does, Trump repeatedly referred to the leader of Egypt as the general. And the Egyptians said they felt this was dismissive, this was disrespectful. They told the United States that al-Sisi would not come to Washington for a meeting with Donald Trump if the Gaza proposal was going to be part of the conversation. And eventually the Egyptians canceled their White House visit, which was actually scheduled for February 18th. So he would have come like the week after King Abdullah had been there. Egypt has privately warned US officials that the peace treaty it signed with Israel at the Camp David Accords are at risk because of this proposal. The Egyptians also said that if the United States withheld the aid that it was promised under the Camp David Accords, that it would view that as a violation of the agreement. Because although, again, Trump speaks in very vague terms, he seemed to suggest on several occasions that the United States would use the foreign and military aid that it gives to Jordan and Egypt to force them to go along with this plan. Egypt is also, like Jordan, in a dire economic situation. It cannot absorb another population, and again, just given the general economic situation. And then lastly, the other close Arab moderate ally of the United States that you would have assumed it would have consulted with before it made a proposal like this is Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis were furious. In fact, they issued a statement at 4:40 a.m. Riyadh time in response to Trump's press conference, in which they were very explicit and very direct and very clear. It said, the establishment of the Palestinian state is a firm, unwavering position, right? His Highness has affirmed this position in a clear and explicit manner that does not allow for any interpretation under any circumstances. Then, he notes, right? Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will not establish diplomatic relations with Israel without a movement towards an independent Palestinian state. Trump wants this agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, right? But he has placed the king now in a, or not the king, the crown prince, in an extraordinarily difficult position, because there is, again, no way that he can actually accept this proposal, right, and then open up relations with Israel, because it just simply would be considered, by the vast majority of the population, they're just not going to support something like that, right? And so they have been, all the US allies have told the United States, this is an unworkable plan, and you have put our security at risk by putting this proposal forward. Now, the blowback to the Gaza press conference led Trump to say on February 21st, in an interview with Fox News, that he wouldn't force it. He thought that it was a good idea, but he wasn't going to go there. And then last night, and I can't play it for you because it does weird things to my computer, but I highly recommend that you watch this. He posted a video about Gaza to his Truth Social and Instagram accounts, right? To a kind of upbeat dance club track. And it's showing what Gaza 2025 is going to look like, right? Gigantic golden statues of Donald Trump. This is obviously an AI-generated video, right? Elon Musk makes multiple appearances. Here he is eating hummus. There's another one of him dancing on a beach in Gaza while dollar bills rain down from above. The bearded belly dancers that make an appearance in here at some point. One of the pictures that isn't on this is of Trump and Netanyahu in bathing suits sitting next to a pool with drinks, right? Clearly very pleased with themselves. There are no words. This is not like one of my students. This is the President of the United States that posted this. You can imagine what the reaction in the region has been. The other thing is, his evangelical Christian supporters are very upset about this video because it's a little bit too golden calf for many of them, right? Too much of a suggestion of idolatry in all of this. They objected to the bearded belly dancers that were in this video. This is Trump didn't make this himself, obviously, right? This is a video that had been kind of circulating on different sites on the internet, but then Trump put it out under his own name last night, right? That makes it an official US document, right?
Was it a deep fake then?
No, it is. It's an AI-generated video. Someone else made this, he saw it, and then he posted it under his own name. Which means it's going to go to the National Archives eventually, right? I really cannot underscore how unbelievable this is, right? And so the February 21st remarks where he says, oh, don't worry, I'm not going to do this. Well, now this is blown up again in the Middle East, right? Oh wait, where am I at? Yes. Right. both cases, the administration is simply blowing through laws and norms, which are reinforcing questions that our allies have about the US's leadership and credibility. With respect to USAID, what the president is doing to USAID is beyond his authority, right, as the president, and is part of a broader assault on congressional authority and the Constitution. The Congressional Research Service has published a report about Trump and USAID, and they noted because Congress established USAID as an independent establishment within the executive branch, the president does not have the authority to abolish it. Congressional authorization would be required to abolish, move, or consolidate USAID. And I will note in the third paragraph where it says that USAID was established as an independent establishment outside of the State Department. Well, that is where it has been taken, right? The whole thing, whatever is left of USAID, is going to be absorbed by the State Department. Now, a huge group of humanitarian agencies sued the administration over the foreign aid work. A U.S. district judge ruled on February 13th that he put in a temporary restraining order. He said the blanket suspension would cause irreparable harm and was likely arbitrary and capricious for failing to consider the immense reliance interests of businesses and organizations around the country. And he told the administration they had to begin making payments to people who the government owed money to from before he made his ruling on February 13th. On February 25th, which I think was only yesterday, right? The same judge ordered the administration that it had until tonight at midnight to fulfill the obligations that he had ordered it to fulfill in his February 13 order. He also said the administration has to provide examples of the communication that it has sent to partners on the ground about resuming assistance, right? The aid groups had gone back to the judge after February 13th, and the judge said that they had shown convincing evidence the administration had not followed the temporary restraining order, and the government did not rebut that position. The judge said today to the government lawyer, I don't know why I can't get a straight answer from you. We are now 12 days in. You can't answer me whether any of the funds covered by the court's order have been unfrozen. Okay? This is potentially, and people keep talking about, well, what happens when the administration defies a court order? Well, we might find out at midnight tonight because, again, the administration, according to the judge, the administration has tried everything to kind of get around this. He did not find the administration in contempt when he filed his order on February 25th, but that may be upcoming. With respect to Gaza and international law, Israel cannot give Gaza to the United States because Israel cannot give Gaza to anyone. It is territory that belongs to potential Palestinian state. Israel is occupying it, but that does not give it ownership over that territory. Nor can the United States simply take Gaza. In general, Trump's positions on Gaza and the West Bank and the Golan Heights undermine the core foundation of the post-World War II order that states cannot take territory by force. Right? If the US can just take Gaza, then why can't China just take Taiwan? Or why can't Russia just take Ukraine? Well, apparently, the United States now believes Russia can just take what it wants from Ukraine. On February 24th, in what I have to say is the most shameful action the United States has taken the entire time that I have been studying US foreign policy, the United States voted against the resolution condemning Russia at the General Assembly. So it voted with countries like North Korea. It voted with countries like Russia, Sudan, right? Hungary. These are not Eritrea. These are not the US's peer group. The US could have abstained on this resolution, but it did not. The Sunday or the London Times, the venerable UK newspaper, in an editorial after this vote said, the United States has incinerated 80 years of global leadership in one vote. People have been kind of laughing and joking about, the US has joined the axis of evil, but it's not a laughing matter. US foreign policy since the end of the Second World War has been about containing the Soviet Union and containing Russia. And we just switched sides, right? All of our allies, except for Israel, are on the other side of this General Assembly vote. And finally, I would say, there is a lack of strategic and long-term thinking that underpins all of this, right? Soft power, which is what you would think of as humanitarian aid or cultural exchanges, etc., it is a key element of US power, and it has been critical to its competition with China. US rivals have been gleeful since the foreign aid ban went in Hungary, in Russia. They have been celebrating that USAID has been destroyed. The US is basically ceding the field to China when it comes to things like in the developing world. If they cannot rely on the United States, if the United States is capable of doing something like just literally pulling the plug on food kitchens in Sudan, or on rape counseling for sexual violence victims in Ethiopia, right? Then the likelihood is they will turn to the Chinese. It's difficult to see how dismantling USAID supports other critical US interests, right? US aid to Syria, for example, helps ensure that the camp where Islamic State fighters and their families are being held by the Syrian Kurds, that camp is being funded, USAID money. It is dangerous, right, for US security, for the conditions in that camp to be destabilized. Humanitarian aid and development aid helps ensure that people can be prosperous in their own country. It is a way to try to prevent migration and to limit the growth of armed extremist groups. When young men are poor and unemployed, when they watch their families go without food, it is much easier to recruit them into an armed extremist group because then they have access to resources. A rebuilding of something that looks like USAID after USAID has been dismantled is just simply not cost effective nor efficient, right? Because when the funding restarts, the people, the programs, the organizations may not be able to get themselves back up again, right? Again, 40% of all humanitarian aid in the world came from the United States. This isn't just the US halted what it was paying. The US has pulled a huge block out of the foundation of the entire international system's ability. We owe the World Food Program, according to the administration, $830 million right now, right? WFP feeds people all over the world. Most humanitarian aid agencies have been saying since this went into effect, the bottom line here is people will die because US assistance has been withdrawn from them. With respect to the Gaza Strip, how does this solve the underlying issue? The underlying issue in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians is not going to go away, even if the 2 million people from Gaza magically disappear, because the West Bank is still there. There are still 3 million Palestinians that live in the West Bank. The Israelis still have nearly 200 settlements and illegal outposts in the West Bank. So even if you magically make Gaza go away, that doesn't fix the problem between the Palestinians and the Israelis. You're just sort of pushing it further down the road. Eventually, there's going to have to be some sort of coming to terms with the political self-determination of the Palestinian peoples. That is the core issue between Israel and its neighbors, right? And turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East in no way affects that. If anything, the rhetoric has only emboldened the hardliners in Israel who favor an annexation of the West Bank. I would note, the United Arab Emirates only signed the Abraham Accords with Israel because it extracted a concession from the Israelis that they would not annex the West Bank. If Israel moves to annex the West Bank, any deal with Saudi Arabia is absolutely, that's it. It's done. It's off the table. Right? So if that is truly what the administration wants, then the Gaza idea is profoundly counterproductive to that. And finally, how does this Gaza proposal contribute to bringing the hostages that remain in Gaza home? How does this proposal contribute to finding a ceasefire, right? Really, what we should have been talking about since February 4th is how do we get those ceasefire negotiations between Hamas and Israel to make sure that the fighting doesn't start again in Gaza. Instead, everybody has been overwhelmed by the blowback from this Gaza proposal. So I will end by simply saying U.S. foreign policy at the moment is in disarray. This is a very dark and low point for the United States in terms of its international reputation. U.S. has repudiated decades-old positions on foreign assistance and on its interests in the Middle East, and substituted instead what one person has called transactional nihilism. When the main adjectives you can use to describe your foreign policy are chaos, confusion, and disruption, that is not a good thing for the United States and its reputation. Right? Relationships between and among states, expertise painstakingly built up, institutions and trust are all hard to build and difficult to maintain. But the United States has blown it up in a month. Okay? So with that, I would be happy to take your questions and comments.